Hi, and welcome to this webinar on the Education Research and Development Centers competition. That's 84.305C, and that is funded through the National Center for Education Research. Just to give you a brief overview of the organizational structure of IES, there are 4 centers housed under the Office of the Director. And the 2 research grant centers are the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research. These are the 2 centers that are primarily responsible for funding grants in education research. You'll also notice the Standards and Review Office, which is connected to the Office of the Director. This is the office that is responsible for organizing the review of the grant applications that come into the 2 research centers. The 2 research centers have similar but slightly different missions. The mission of the National Center for Education Research, or NCER, is to support rigorous research that addresses the nation's most pressing education needs from early childhood to adult education. And the mission for the National Center for Special Education Research, or NCSER, is to sponsor research on special education that's designed to expand the knowledge and understanding of infants, toddlers, and students with or at risk for disabilities from birth through high school. Through their various grant programs, IES and the 2 centers support research on the development or identification of education interventions. And by interventions, we mean practices, programs, policies, and approaches. These interventions should enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed. Also, another research objective for the 2 centers is to identify what does not work in education and thereby encourage innovation and further research, and to understand the processes that underlie the effectiveness of education interventions and the variation in their effectiveness. So in other words, what works, what doesn't work, and for whom it works, and in what contexts. The 2 research centers support a number of different research grant competitions, but in this webinar we will be discussing just one, the Research and Development Centers program, which is being funded through the National Center for Education Research this year in FY 2018. The National Research and Development Centers are responsible for contributing to the solution of a specific education problem and to the generation of new knowledge and theories relevant to the focus of the center. Centers are also responsible for conducting relatively rapid research and scholarship on supplemental questions that emerge within the center's topic area, and providing national leadership within the center's topic through disseminating research and engaging in dialogue with researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. They achieve these goals, as I said, through research, development, evaluation, national leadership, and dissemination. Each research and development center is responsible for a number of activities, the first of which is the focused program of research. This is how the center contributes to the solution of a specific education problem and generates new knowledge and theories. In your application, you must allocate at least 75% of your total budget to the focused program of research. Each research and development center will also be responsible for supplemental activities, which are typically, but not always, meetings and smaller scale studies. The center will work cooperatively with IES to select and design the supplemental activities after an award has been made. In your application, you do not need to provide a detailed plan. As I said, the specific activities will be developed after the center begins. You should show that you have the capacity for conducting the supplemental activities in your research narrative, and you must set aside at least 5% of your total budget for the supplemental activities. Finally, each research and development center will be responsible for engaging in leadership and dissemination activities. These include engaging with researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. You should have a website with reports and papers. The Institute encourages you to use innovative technology such as webinars and podcasts, or something even more innovative in your leadership and dissemination activities. Your manuscripts should be published through ERIC, the Education Resources Information Center. And you need to make your final research data available for others' use. In your application, under this section, you should describe the audiences and activities which you will engage in, and you should show capacity for leadership and outreach. Your proposal narrative includes 5 sections, and the center narrative is really the heart of your application, where you set out your plan for research and the justification for it. The peer reviewers tend to focus their attention on the center narrative, and it is recommended that your center narrative be no more than 35 pages. The first 2 sections of your narrative, the significance and the research plan, are specific to the individual center, and so will vary by topic. Each of those sections will be covered in more depth in the specific sections on the specific topics that follow this introductory section. In the leadership and outreach activities section, you should again discuss the audiences you intend to reach and the researchers and practitioners you intend to work with or to obtain input from. In the 4th section, the management and institutional resources section, make sure that you discuss the organizational structure of your center and the management plan for how it will run, and the resources available to conduct the work of the center. Personnel may vary slightly by center, and so we will discuss that on each of the topics that follow, but in general, you should think about who will carry out which part of the proposed work, what expertise and experience each of those people have to do this type of work, and how much time they have committed to the project. This year, the National Center for Education Research will be competing 4 research and development centers. The first is the Improving Education Outcomes for Disadvantaged Students in Choice Schools Center. That has a maximum grant duration of 5 years and $10 million. The Improving Rural Education Center has a maximum duration of 5 years and a maximum award of $10 million. The Writing in Secondary Schools Center has a maximum of 5 years and $5 million. And the Exploring Science Teaching in Elementary School Classrooms Center has a maximum duration of 5 years and a maximum award of $5 million. These maximums are true maximums if you request a duration greater than 5 years or an award amount greater than that listed on this slide and in the request for applications. Your application will not be reviewed. It will be deemed non-responsive. So it's very important that you abide by these maximums. Keep in mind that this webinar is not a substitute for reading the request for applications, so you should definitely go to our website, ies.ed.gov/funding, and make sure that you read the RFA for 305C so that you can get more detailed information about everything we discussed today. So now we will discuss each of these 4 centers in greater detail. One of the research and development centers being competed this year by the National Center for Education Research is the Writing in Secondary Schools Center. IES is requesting applications to establish a National Research and Development Center on writing in secondary schools to describe how students develop writing skills across secondary school and to understand how best to support all students to become better writers and or to improve the ability to measure student writing quality. Writing is an essential skill for communication, self-expression, and learning content knowledge, yet it tends to receive less attention as a subject of instruction than other content areas such as reading and math. Results from the most recent writing portion of the National Assessment of Educational Progress show that 1 out of 5 students in 8th and 12th grade are unable to address writing tasks appropriately and to communicate effectively. Despite the need for high-quality supports and interventions for secondary students to learn to write, the research in this area is relatively weak. IES would like to address some of the gaps in research on this topic by establishing a center to engage in a focused program of research that includes at least 2 studies. You must propose to conduct an exploration study And in addition to the exploration study, you also have a choice of proposing either a development study or a measurement study. So while you must do an exploration study, you can choose between the development or the measurement study. So you must propose an exploration study that addresses at least one of the following research areas: secondary data analyses of student writing to answer questions such as what are the features of high quality writing or the writing difficulties of subgroups of students, or longitudinal exploration of how writing skills develop over time for all students of all skill levels, or research examining the role of self-efficacy and motivation in predicting writing outcomes in secondary schools. In addition to the exploration study, you must propose either a development study or a measurement study. The development study should develop and pilot test interventions to improve writing for secondary students. The measurement study should develop and validate measures of writing quality. You may choose to conduct the studies in any order you choose or concurrently. For example, you may choose to develop and validate measures of writing quality for use in the exploration study. Alternatively, you may use the exploration study to inform the development of an intervention or the development of a measure of writing quality. There are some general requirements for the Writing Center. First, in terms of sample, your research must focus on typically developing students. You may propose to examine subgroups of students, which may include students with disabilities, but such students may not be the primary focus of your study. Your sample must focus on students enrolled in grades 6 through 12, regardless of the grade configuration of their schools. You should include students from at least 2 grades, including at least 1 grade from middle school, grades 6 through 8, and 1 grade from high school, grades 9 through 12. Your sample must include students who are low achieving in writing, though these students do not need to comprise the entire sample. In terms of outcomes, you must include measures of student writing. And in terms of setting, you must conduct your research in authentic 6 through 12 education settings. Please refer to the RFA for additional information on authentic education settings. Your center narrative must include 5 sections: significance, research plan, leadership and outreach activities, management and institutional resources, and personnel. The leadership and outreach activities and the management and institutional resources were covered in the introductory section of this webinar. So for this section, we're only going to talk about the significance, the research plan, and the personnel sections. IES recommends that your narrative not exceed 35 pages. The significance section of your application is where you describe the major issues and research questions that the center will address and the conceptual framework that will guide the center's work. Explain your understanding of the problems the center is meant to address, propose an overall vision for the center, and describe a coordinated set of research and leadership activities. Include a description of your conceptual framework and/or perspective and how the theoretical framework will guide the center's work. In your literature review, consider the specific opportunities and challenges of writing in secondary schools, including but not limited to features of high-quality writing, developmental trajectories, feedback from teachers and peers, motivation, self-efficacy and identity, content area or discipline, genre, technology, and assessment. Again, you may consider other specific opportunities and challenges of writing in secondary schools in addition to those in this list. The research plan section of your narrative should describe the research design for each study. That's the exploration study and the development or measurement study. You should outline the data analysis procedures for each study. The Institute encourages you to identify a diverse sample with regards to factors such as writing ability, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and geographic location. In your research plan section of your narrative, you should describe the malleable factors you will study and how you will expect them to be associated with specific student writing outcomes, as well as any mediators or moderators. If you're proposing a development study, you should describe the intervention you will develop and pilot test and how you expect the intervention to improve writing outcomes for secondary students. If you are proposing a measurement study, you should explain your decision to develop a new measure or revise an existing measure. And if you propose to develop a new measure, you should contrast the measure with current typical assessment practice and its identifying shortcomings. For the personnel section of your narrative, you should identify and describe the qualifications of the members of the research team. For each research team member, describe her or his expertise, responsibility, and time commitment. Competitive applications will have leadership and staff who collectively demonstrate expertise in content areas relevant to writing in secondary schools, methodological and measurement expertise to carry out the proposed projects, sufficient experience working with education delivery settings to carry out the projects, experience that's relevant to national leadership, and experience and capacity to manage a project of this size and type. Applicants are encouraged to put together multidisciplinary teams to incorporate different perspectives and methods into the center's work. And applicants are especially encouraged to include at least one team member with expertise in adolescent development. The maximum duration for the Writing Center is 5 years. The maximum award is $5 million. That's the total cost, which is the direct and indirect costs. At least 75% of the total budget must be allocated to the focus program of research, and at least 5% of the maximum award, which would be $250,000, must be reserved for supplementary studies to be designed in collaboration with the Institute. These are requirements. If you go over the maximum duration or the maximum award, your application will be deemed non-responsive and will not be sent forward for review.
Let's talk a little bit about the appendices in your proposal submission. Use Appendix A to describe the required response to reviewers. How is the revised application responsive to prior reviews? If you have submitted a somewhat similar application in the past, but are submitting the current application as a new application, you should use Appendix A to provide a rationale explaining why the current application should be considered a new application rather than a resubmitted application. This appendix may be only relevant for the Science Teaching Center, which was competed as a network last year. Use Appendix B to include figures, charts, or tables that supplement the center narrative as well as examples of measures. These include individual items, tests, surveys, observation, and interview protocols that you'll be using to collect data in your project. You may also include a timeline of project activities here. Remember though, do not include narrative text here. In Appendix C, if you're proposing to explore, develop, evaluate, or validate an intervention or assessment, you may want to include examples of those materials, computer screenshots, assessment items, or other materials used in the intervention or assessment to be explored, developed, evaluated, or validated. The difference between Appendix B and Appendix C is that Appendix C contains the measures or materials that may be used in any practices, programs, or policies that you're studying. Again, do not include narrative content here. Include in Appendix D the letters of agreement from partners, such as schools and districts, data sources, such as state agencies holding administrative data, and consultants. Ensure that the letters reproduce well so that the reviewers can easily read them. Do not reduce the font or margins. Letters of agreement should include enough information to make it clear that the author of the letter understands the nature of the commitment of time, space, and resources to the research project that will be required if the application is funded. A common reason for projects to fail is the loss of participating schools and districts. Letters of agreement regarding the provision of data should make it clear that the author of the letter will provide the data described in the application for use in the proposed research and in time to meet the proposed schedule. Appendix E is where you would include your data management plan. You must include a data management plan to be responsive to the RFA. The content of the DMP is discussed starting on page 7 in the RFA under Part 2, Section A5, titled Dissemination. You should consult your resources or our resources on the IES website, which will tell you the key components in your data management plan. Here are the important dates and deadlines. Applications are due September 21, 2017, 4:30 p.m. DC time. Please note that the Institute does not accept late applications. Letters of intent are optional, non-binding, and not used in the scientific peer review of a subsequent application. However, when you submit a letter of intent, one of the Institute's program officers will contact you regarding your proposed research to offer assistance. The Institute also uses the letter of intent to identify expertise needed for the scientific peer review panels and to secure a sufficient number of reviewers to handle the anticipated number of applications. Should you miss the deadline for submitting a letter of intent, you still may submit an application. If you miss the letter of intent deadline, the Institute asks you to inform the relevant program officer of your intention to submit an application. Please see page 59 of the RFA for more information about the letter of intent. After you submit your application, our Standards and Review Office begins the peer review process. Applications are reviewed for compliance and responsiveness to the RFA. Those applications that are compliant and responsive are assigned to a review panel where 2 or 3 panel members conduct a primary review of each application. The most competitive applications move to full panel. After the peer review process is complete and decisions are finalized, applicants will receive email notification that the status of the award and the reviewer summary statement are available via the application notification system. If you are not granted an award the first time, consider resubmitting and talking with your program officer. Here are some tips to strengthen your application. First, we strongly advise applicants to pay very close attention to the recommendations for strong applications. Those recommendations come from IES experience, and reviewers use those recommendations to distinguish between high and low quality applications. So do look through that list of recommendations and incorporate that into your application. I actually tell this to many of my grantees actually. Put yourself in your reviewer's shoes. And the image I like to use is think of someone who, after already putting a full day's work and has said goodnight to their families, who then begins to read their stack of applications. Or the reviewers who are on a plane or whatever multitasking case may be, remember it's going to make a big difference how clearly you can get across the information you need to get to the reviewer. It makes such a difference for reviewers when the writing is clear and they find information very easily. So think carefully about when to use diagrams and figures to explain complex ideas. Think carefully about whether or not a diagram or a figure is more effective in getting your message across, rather than putting it into text. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And certainly you don't want diagrams that then contain such small print that no one can really see what you're trying to communicate. Think about how you're going to organize the text. Think about how you might use headings and subheadings to communicate the key aspects of your proposal. You might consider using the same headings from the RFA, since reviewers likely are used to seeing IES RFAs. Think about when to use bullet points and boldface to underscore key points to catch the eye of the reviewers so that they can find information much more easily. And then finally, we recommend to all our applicants to seek others' input before you submit your proposal. Try to get a strong, full draft done as early as you can so that you have time to then share your draft with a colleague or 2 or 6, especially those who are not involved with your proposal. Those colleagues should be both within and outside of that niche area. You want reviewers that will comb through your application with a real critical eye. You should certainly contact the program officer and bounce ideas off of her or him. Here's the contact information for each of the program officers overseeing topics in this RFA. I strongly encourage you to reach out to them to discuss your proposal ideas and their fit with the RFA. Email is typically the best way to communicate with us, especially during this busy time of year. In any case, we hope you found this webinar helpful, and we wish you good luck in this process.